Now we'll hear from Dr. Coolong, and he'll be talking about cultivar selection and nutrient management to control Alternaria in broccoli.
Well, everyone's leaving. I am this one. There we go. All right, so Bhabesh spoke about kind of the fungicide resistance, culturing, and that sort of part of this experiment. I'm doing with Kate Cassidy-Duffy and Ted McAvoy. We're doing variety trialing, fertility trialing, and then a little bit on irrigation timing and so forth. And so I'm going to go through our first year results. We just got our fall 2022 results in, so I haven't crunched them yet, but we'll go through that here in a second. So as Bhabesh already mentioned, this is part of a large trial between Virginia Tech, Cornell, University of Connecticut, and so on. So what we did is we looked at commercial varieties. We had 26 varieties for Athens and Tifton in each location. We did irrigation timing to look at how that affects Alternaria, and then fertility trials. I'll put a caveat on the variety trials. When we went through, we got as many commercial varieties as we could out of our seed catalogs. I've done broccoli variety trials in the Southeast for a long time. I understand that there's a number of these that wouldn't fit our slot in terms of production, but we wanted to see if they had resistance and so forth. So we typically planted the last couple of days of August, first couple of days of September. So right at, it's still pretty hot in that window there, so we got pretty good growth. We do a double bed system, 6-foot centers, usually 8-inch in-row spacing, so we got about 21,000 plants per acre. Folks out west obviously do a lot more. Folks on 5-foot centers would have a higher population as well. We used Alternaria brassicola 3 weeks after planting. We inoculated, and we used a sensitive isolate from Bhabesh. I will say that the pictures and data I'm going to show, you're going to see a lot of Alternaria. You're going to see some pretty torn up plants, to be honest with you. But keep in mind, that was inoculated. We backpack sprayed, we inoculated every plant, and so out there, you know, growing on the farm and stuff, you're probably not going to have, I would hope you would not have this type of pressure and so forth. But this is a picture of about what the broccoli looked like when we inoculated the plants 3 weeks after planting. And so this is just a list of all the cultivars we use. You'll see, you know, like Eastern Crown, Emerald Crown, across the whole board, Imperial, some other stuff. In our other trials, as far as our fertility and the misting trial, we used Emerald Crown in those trials as kind of our standard and so forth. I know some folks are getting pictures of that. It's kind of hard to see. And so what we did was, you know, we grew it out like a standard trial, but we took disease ratings on our foliage, and then we also, at harvest, we scraped every head. And so every individual head that was harvested, we were out there scraping the beads off it to evaluate Alternaria. And the reason this is important is because a lot of times we would inoculate our plants, they'd get Alternaria, they would drop those lower leaves, and then the new growth looked pretty good. And so in some of those heads actually on the surface looked all right. But as soon as we scraped off those beads, then we saw that Alternaria in there. And I thought that was worth mentioning because if you have some Alternaria early in the season, you spray, you think you're in front of that infection, and your heads might look okay, when you harvest them, there still can be Alternaria in that head. Just like Bhabesh said, it's very sensitive. And so we scraped all of our heads, and we did get some different results from where, if you just look at that head, the symptoms on the surface, and after you scrape it. And so we evaluated these for disease. We gave them a rating. Of course, if you're a commercial farmer, really you have no threshold for Alternaria. But something like this, we would have been, you know, a 90% infection. Something like this, we would have been maybe about a 20 or so, just to give you an idea of where we were. Very large differences in foliar growth and foliar infection, like I said. It didn't always match the head, and you can see here this is a pretty sensitive variety. Got a lot of alternaria here. I will say that overall some of the later varieties tended to seem to do a little bit better in terms of resistance. That may be just the varieties resistant. It could be that the weather conditions are changing a little bit later. Those varieties also tend to grow a little bit longer, so they tend to be a little bit of a bigger framed plant as well. But just to show you some of the differences out there in what we have in terms of genetics, Babesh's grad student took this photo. I've got a bunch of photos similar. This was taken in Tifton. Obviously, this plot was not harvested yet. I think this was Marathon here, but you can see just probably 20 feet over this plot, Ted had just harvested, and you can see how bad the infection is here. And so there were very dramatic differences in terms of tolerance to Alternaria. And then one other thing I will say, early in the season, particularly this fall, it was pretty dry early on. And so we inoculated, didn't have a tremendous amount of disease at first, but it was kind of mid-October, late October, when we started getting days like this in the morning. And as soon as we started getting these, foggy, dewy mornings, that's when our disease took off. And the temperature dropped a little bit too. I don't know if that's independent of the fog and the moisture, but this was harvesting up in Athens one morning. And you can see once we had these conditions, disease kind of took off. So this is head severity ratings. I know there's a lot on this screen. This is Tifton and Athens. Tifton tended to be a little bit more severe than Athens. Of course, Athens is usually about 3 degrees cooler during that time of year and so forth. This is actually 2021 data. So the percent head disease severity, something like Marathon, was 2.7%. Here in Athens, it was 1.2%. But then you go all the way down here, you've got down in Tifton, something like Lieutenant or Eiffel was 77, 78%. Eastern Crown up in Athens was about 80%. It was 62% in Tifton. And I know a lot of folks grow Eastern Crown. Emerald Crown was right there around 60%. And so it was fairly sensitive to Alternaria and so forth. We're still crunching this year's data, but obviously things between locations jump around a little bit, but on the top end of things and on the bottom end of things, they were pretty consistent in terms of what was showing kind of the most tolerance and so forth. All right, so here are head disease severity. These were the most resistant up in Athens, and then in Tifton here, so Bellstar, Marathon, Vallejo, which I think is being discontinued. I'm not 100% sure, and Emerald Pride did pretty well too. In Tifton, it was Bellstar, Marathon, Vallejo, and Emerald Pride. So you see these numbers are fairly low. Considering we inoculated, they're doing pretty well under those conditions. Least resistant, Eastern Crown, Asteroid, Millennium, and Lieutenant, they're all up in that range. And so, again, we do have some pretty good differences in genetics and resistance there. Here's what some of our lowest head severities look like. Here was Vallejo. This is what it looked like at harvest, and then after scraping, you see it's a nice clean head, Bellstar and Marathon. Now I understand, like I said earlier, some of these varieties aren't really going to fit our slot necessarily in terms of appearance and performance, but as far as severity of disease, they did pretty well. And then here's Eastern Crown and Millennium, and that would be actually, I mean, this is obviously a severe head, but in those really bad cases, this is kind of what things look like and so forth. And you can see all the scraped heads piled up there in the truck. So we'll have more, once we get this data crunched, we'll come out with a kind of a list of recommendations and so forth after this year. But to me, it's very interesting as far as there is a lot of, I think, tolerance and resistance out there in the current genetics. It's just documenting that and so forth so growers can make decisions moving forward. The other thing, this is a little bit of a smaller study. We wanted to look at effective irrigation timing. As most all of our broccoli is overhead irrigated in the state, we do have a few folks on second crop plastic or third crop plastic, but by and large it's overhead irrigated. And so we wanted to look at the spread of disease and as far as timing of irrigation. And so this trial we did, everything was watered with drip irrigation. And then we had 4 treatments, one where we only did drip, there's no overhead. We timed it so we could have overhead at 6, noon, and 6 p.m. And basically, the way we timed this was that we just wet the foliage. We had little mist emitters here. We wet the foliage for like 10 minutes, just to kind of simulate an overhead if your pivot was moving over the field or something like that. And then track disease. And so we track leaf moisture and everything else as well. And so pretty much this is, the red bar here is percent marketable heads, and the blue is disease. And so you can see this is the drip with no overhead irrigation. We had the most marketable heads and the least disease, makes sense. And then 6 a.m. in terms of disease, 6 a.m. was just as good as our control. We had a little bit fewer marketable heads. And then later in the day, noon and then 6 p.m., our disease levels rose and our marketable heads dropped. And so this makes sense. We kind of always told people this at meetings, but we wanted to actually have the data to back it up. Whereas if you're watering later in the day, you're tending to wet that foliage and it stays wet throughout the evening and night hours, and so you have more disease. Whereas actually in the morning at 6 a.m., there's a lot of dew on those leaves. When that water hits them, given the nature of a broccoli leaf is real waxy and stuff, a lot of that water pools and just kind of rolls off and so forth. I understand if you've got a pivot and you've got 100 acres of broccoli, you can't necessarily water it all first thing in the morning, but this is kind of interesting data. And this is how we measured leaf wetness. The other thing I wanted to mention, and Bhabesh and I were talking about this earlier, if you look at these broccoli leaves here, you'll notice the bottom leaves have a lot more moisture sitting on them. And those lower leaves tend to have, at least appearance-wise, a little bit of a thinner cuticle, and they're not shedding that water as quickly. And we also notice when we inoculate, you can see all the disease down here in these lower leaves and stuff. And so there might be something to that as far as penetration into the plant. Those leaves also tend to stay wetter and so forth throughout the day. As far as disease severity, again, this is tracking that disease through the season. This is days after inoculation. So this red bar here is drip, the blue is 6 a.m., the purple is 6 p.m., and then this is noon. And you can see there's not great separation, but generally those trends are later in the day, you're going to have more disease building throughout the season and so forth. Again, we inoculated everything, so our drip is still going to have some disease. So that was our irrigation timing, and then we also did fertilizer impact on Alternaria, both in Athens and Tifton. And basically what we wanted to do was kind of bracket the recommended rates. We have 50, 75, 100, 125, and 150% of recommended nitrogen. And so in Athens, on that heavier clay soil, we tend to put out less fertilizer. So that went from 75 up to 225. And then in Tifton, on the lighter sandy ground, if we use 200 pounds as our recommendation, we went from 100 to 300. The way we did this was everything got 500 pounds of triple 10 pre-plant, and then we came back in with 2 applications of calcium nitrate. And that's what we varied as far as changing our nitrogen levels and so forth. And we did those at 4 and 6 weeks post-transplant. This year, I think we did this a few days earlier, 3.5 weeks and so forth. And so as far as fertility goes, the disease here in blue is Tifton and red is Athens. And you can see across the board, Tifton had higher disease, which makes sense. It's a more humid environment, tends to stay warmer late in the season. And then here's Athens in the red bar. Generally, in Tifton, we had no differences between our trends. In Athens, our 100%, 125, and 150 were statistically, they had a little bit more disease than our lower fertility, but it wasn't a really big separation, so I really want to do this again to see where we're at. So the disease we're a little bit on the fence on as far as fertility goes right now. And then nitrogen here, marketable heads. Tifton, like I said, see those blue bars there, had much more disease. And then you look at marketable heads. Athens is the red, Tifton's the blue. Athens had far more marketable heads than Tifton, just showing you how much greater the pressure is, and the climate down there pushes that. Here, we had 0% marketable heads. I think the highest we got was about 15%. Tifton's a little bit rougher. And even in Athens, we were 55, 60% of marketable heads. And this general weather, like I said earlier, Tifton tends to be a little bit warmer. Athens, actually, our high temperature this year was just as high as Tifton during that growing period. And we had about the same amount of rain, a little bit less than last year and so forth. And we did get colder in Athens. This was kind of our last harvest here. We got a good hard freeze. And I think Tifton, Ted, you went a little bit longer than that. Down in Tifton this year, I believe. But that's, happy to take any questions if folks have them. Yes?
Dr. Coolong, what was the variety which you planted in the nitrogen soil? Was that the susceptible one?
It was Emerald Crown, yeah. So it was, that was what we kind of used. It's been around for a long time, and so for the fertility and the misting irrigation trials, that's what we used as kind of our standard. All right, well, hopefully, once we crunch data from this year, we will have some recommendations from folks and move forward.